November 11th, 2012. The quiet, sun-bleached paradise of Ambergris Cay, Belize, is shattered by a single grim discovery. A neighbor, Gregory Fall, is found on his villa floor with a 9mm bullet lodged in his skull. By dawn, the Belizean police aren't looking for a cartel hitman or a common thief. They name their suspect John McAfee, the eccentric millionaire who wrote the code protecting half the world's computers. From digital plagues is now the prime suspect in a very analog, very brutal homicide. But when the officers arrive at his beachfront compound to question him, they find only the ghosts of his presence. The gate is open. The house is empty. John McAfee is gone, vanished into the dense, suffocating jungle like a vapor. What happens next defies logic, law enforcement procedure, and the very fabric of international justice. He will fake his own death not once, but twice. He will bribe his way out of a Guatemalan deportation cell just hours before being handed over to certain imprisonment. He will evade the FBI for 18 relentless months aboard a yacht, not by hiding in silence, but by taunting them on Twitter, posting his exact coordinates with the arrogance of a man who believes himself untouchable. Every time the net tightens, he slips through a seam no one else can see. 3 countries issue warrants. Interpol joins the hunt. The US government, the most powerful surveillance and enforcement apparatus on the planet, deploys significant international resources to catch one aging programmer. And time after time, he makes them look like amateurs. This isn't just a fugitive story. It's a psychological case study. It's a masterclass in exploiting the gap between digital identity and physical reality. It's the story of a man who spent his life building a fortress against digital fear, only to become the embodiment of real-world chaos. How does one person stay free that long? And what happens when the man who swore he'd never be caged finally hears the cell door lock behind him? The story doesn't start in a Belizean jungle. It starts in the sterile, humming labs of Lockheed in Silicon Valley. John McAfee is a brilliant, erratic engineer, sees the future and the future's vulnerable. Personal computers are proliferating in homes and offices like rabbits, and with them comes a new, visible predator. The brain virus, the first IBM PC-compatible virus spreading through the shared floppy disks of an unsuspecting public. McAfee doesn't just see code, he sees the market. He sees the panic in the eyes of IT managers who realize their entire payroll database could be eaten alive by a few lines of rogue programming. In his spare time, hunched over a terminal, he writes a detection program. Just 12 lines of elegant defensive logic. He calls it VirusScan. What made McAfee a fortune wasn't just the software. It was the psychological warfare he waged to sell it. He understood a fundamental truth about human nature better than any of his peers. Fear sells faster than features. In a grainy 1989 interview, he didn't talk about scanning algorithms. He warned that computer viruses would cause companies to near collapse from financial loss. He amplified the terror. Just enough to make his product the only logical life raft. The strategy was brutally effective. By 1990, half of the Fortune 100 were paying him for protection. Revenue hit $5 million annually and was doubling every 6 months. McAfee Associates was born from the trunk of his Datsun and grew into an empire. John McAfee became Silicon Valley royalty, the man who tamed the digital wilderness so we could sleep at night. But there was a rot at the core of this success. John despised the throne he had built. Board meetings, with their PowerPoints and politics, were a form of slow suffocation. Quarterly earnings calls felt like a prison sentence to a man whose mind moved at the speed of light. He complained to friends about the 1,000 bosses, the shareholders, the regulators, the lawyers, all demanding conformity from a man who was pathologically incapable of it. This was a man who got expelled from a doctoral program for an affair with a professor's daughter, a man who got fired from an engineering job for arriving high on hallucinogens, a man who once hid behind a dumpster in a drug-induced panic attack because he thought a vacuum cleaner salesman was an undercover agent. He hosted occult ceremonies and workplace sex contests at his company's headquarters, not just for kicks, but as a deliberate thumb in the eye of convention. Corporate life was suffocating his soul. In 1993, he made the cleanest break possible. He cashed out his shares for approximately $100 million and walked away from the empire that still bears his name. He was 48 years old, impossibly wealthy, and, for the first time in his adult life, completely free. For a while, the freedom was enough. He drifted through yoga retreats, flew ultralight aircraft over the desert, and devoured books on Eastern mysticism. But a mind built for paranoia cannot find peace in meditation. The 2008 financial crash acted as a wrecking ball to his fortune. His net worth didn't just dip, cratered from 9 figures down to a mere $4 million. For most people, $4 million is a safety net. For McAfee, it was a crisis of identity and a confirmation of his darkest suspicions. He decided, with the fervor of a convert, that governments and financial institutions were parasites, designed solely to drain individual freedom and creativity. "I will never let the state own my life," he told a reporter. It wasn't a boast, it was a vow. In 2009, he boarded a plane to Belize. No extradition treaty, no IRS, and he thought no rules. He bought a slice of paradise on Ambergris Cay, then a sprawling jungle compound near Orange Walk. Here, he could be the king of his own universe. He surrounded himself with armed bodyguards, a mix of local muscle and ex-convicts whose loyalty was secured by a steady stream of cash. He built a makeshift lab to research herbal antibiotics, claiming he was on the verge of curing superbugs with jungle plants. He surrounded himself with young girlfriends and created an atmosphere of loyalty bound by money, excitement, and an undercurrent of fear. Locals whispered that the rich American was loco. By day, he piloted his ultralight plane over the reef, a tiny speck of defiance against the vast blue sky. By night, his compound glowed with bonfire parties where automatic weapons were displayed like party favors. To outsiders, he was just another eccentric expat playing scientist and soldier of fortune. But the jungle has a way of turning a man's fears inward. His business paranoia, once a sharp tool for marketing, was curdling into isolation psychosis. He picked fights with local gangsters over perceived territorial slights. He butted heads with neighbors over the incessant barking of his pack of guard dogs. Belize, he would learn too late, is not a place where a gringo gets to write his own laws. And the fuse was already lit. April 30th, 2012. The Belizean Gang Suppression Unit hit McAfee's compound with military precision, and critically, without any warrant shown. Officers in tactical gear stormed the property, shouting commands. They lined up McAfee, his girlfriend Samantha, and his staff against a wall at gunpoint. McAfee's 4 massive mastiffs, bred and trained for exactly this moment, charged the intruders. An officer shouted a warning, then raised his shotgun. One dog lunged, and a thunderous blast dropped the animal mid-stride. "He killed my fucking dog," McAfee screamed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and genuine primal grief. The officers pinned him face down in the dirt. For the next 6 hours, they ransacked his life. They overturned lab equipment, confiscated rifles and pistols, and seized bottles of chemicals McAfee insisted were harmless antibiotic compounds. The result of this massive paramilitary operation? 0 drugs. The only charge they could make stick was possessing an unlicensed firearm or paperwork misdemeanor, but they hauled him to Belize City anyway. They threw him in the piss house, the Belize Central Prison's holding tank. It's named for the open sewer that literally ran through it. McAfee spent one night in that hellhole. He bribed a guard with a $100 bill for a single cigarette and used a garbage bag as a belt because they had taken his. He was released the next morning without charges. The damage was irreversible. A switch deep inside, John McAfee flipped from eccentric to combatant. He decided, with unshakable certainty, that the government of Belize wanted him dead. Was he paranoid? Absolutely. Was he wrong? That's a question that gets harder to answer the deeper you look. After the raid, he slept with a Glock under his pillow, installed tripwires and cameras. He babbled to visitors about assassination plots and a grand conspiracy between the police and the cartels. The Prime Minister of Belize would later call him extremely paranoid, even bonkers. John wore that description like a Medal of Honor. Only the paranoid survive, he'd retort. Just 50 yards away from McAfee's volatile compound lived Gregory Fall, 52-year-old expat from Florida who had moved to Belize for silence and sunshine. Instead, he got John McAfee as a neighbor. McAfee's 9 dogs roamed the beach freely, barking through the night and occasionally nipping at tourists. Fall filed complaints. He wrote letters to the mayor about noise violations and dangerous animals. The feud simmered for weeks until Fall confronted McAfee directly. The conversation was reportedly tense. "Control your dogs or I'll take care of them myself," Fall allegedly warned. McAfee refused. He needed the dogs. They were his early warning system. Then, on the night of November 9th, 2012, something broke. McAfee's dogs started foaming at the mouth. One by one, 4 of his beloved animals collapsed, convulsing in the dirt. By dawn, they were dead. Poisoned. John was devastated, and then the devastation curdled into a white-hot, blinding rage. Ordered his staff to shoot the dying animals to end their agony. He grabbed his pistol and paced the compound like a caged animal, seething. Someone had sent a message. Was it the cartels? Or was it that gringo neighbor who had threatened them just hours earlier? 24 hours later, November 10th, 2012, a single gunshot cracked the night air on Ambergris. Neighbors heard it but dismissed it as a firecracker or a car backfiring. It was neither. The next morning, Sunday, November 11th, housekeeper found Gregory Fall lying face up on his villa floor in a pool of congealed blood. A 9mm round had entered the back of his head. Execution style. His laptop and cell phone were missing. The island froze. American had been murdered in paradise. Police immediately went to question the volatile neighbor. When they arrived at McAfee's compound around noon, they found the gate open and the house abandoned. John had seen them coming. He grabbed Samantha and vanished into the jungle. By the time officers were knocking on his door, he was literally underground, buried in sand with a cardboard box over his head to breathe, just as the opening scene of this story showed. The man who had protected millions of computers was now the prime suspect in a homicide, and he had just declared war on an entire government. John didn't run blind. This wasn't panic. This was a long-planned contingency. He had spent months mapping safe houses and cultivating contacts, people who can't be followed, he'd whisper to a journalist later. Within 6 hours of going underground, he and Samantha were moving through a network of hideouts in the Belizean interior. Abandoned warehouses, the homes of sympathetic locals, a rotting fishing shack on a mangrove river. Police and soldiers swept the district with dogs and helicopters. They set up roadblocks on every highway. They raided the homes of anyone connected to McAfee. But John stayed a ghost. He was a 70-year-old man with a heart condition, but his mind was a tactical map. He knew how they thought, because he had spent his life thinking like a hacker, always looking for the back door, the unguarded exit. On day 3, holed up in a concrete bunker while police searched 200 yards away, John found an old TV and tuned into Swiss Family Robinson. He sat there eating cold canned beans, watching the family build a bamboo fortress, and laughed at the absurd parallel. "Maybe I should build a treehouse," he joked to Samantha. But he needed an exit. On November 14th, 2012, under cover of darkness, McAfee paid a fisherman $2,000 in cash for an illegal crossing into Guatemala. The boat cut its engine and drifted silently into Guatemalan waters. By 3 a.m., they landed on a deserted beach. By sunrise, they were in Guatemala City, checking into the Villa Royale Hotel under fake names. For the first time in 72 hours, John exhaled. But John McAfee was a fugitive who couldn't stand the silence. He craved the spotlight. He contacted Vice magazine and offered them an exclusive, an interview with the world's most wanted antivirus mogul. The editor and a photographer flew down, spent 2 days with him, and posted a triumphant blog update titled, "We are with John McAfee right now, suckers." The article went viral. John felt invincible. It was the biggest mistake he ever made. Within hours of the post going live, a hacker tweeted him, "John, I found you. Check your photos, EXIF data." The picture Vice had published contained GPS metadata. Exact coordinates, longitude and latitude of the hotel lobby. Every intelligence agency and police force on the planet now knew precisely where McAfee was sitting. His media stunt had just turned into a catastrophic cell phone. On December 5th, 2012, Guatemalan police stormed the Villa Royale Hotel. McAfee was in the lobby, mid-sentence with his lawyers, when he was surrounded. Handcuffs snapped on, cameras flashed. He was charged with illegal entry, and the consequence was immediate. Deportation back to Belize within 48 hours. For John, Belize was a death sentence. He was convinced the moment he was handed over, he'd vanish into a dark cell or a shallow grave. The clock was ticking louder than ever. December 6th, 2012. Locked in a Guatemalan detention cell, McAfee collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. Mi corazón. He gasped, turning a sickly pale shade. Guards panicked. An ambulance rushed him to a Guatemala City hospital. News broke worldwide. John McAfee suffers 2 heart attacks in custody. The Guatemalan government, terrified of an international incident and the bad press of a famous prisoner dying on their watch, paused the deportation. Reporters swarmed the hospital. John lay on a gurney with oxygen tubes, grimacing dramatically for the cameras. 48 hours later, doctors announced he was stable. No heart damage detected, just slightly elevated blood pressure. John later smirked to the press. Of course. I didn't have a heart attack. He admitted he had hyperventilated and held his breath to spike his blood pressure readings. He had sold the performance with Academy Award conviction. This piece of theater bought his lawyers just enough time to gum up the bureaucratic works with emergency appeals. In the chaos, Guatemala's government took the path of least resistance. Due to a legal quirk, he had entered Guatemala illegally from Belize. They could technically repatriate him to his country of origin. They deported John McAfee not to Belize but to the United States. John had just checkmated an entire nation with nothing more than his own breath. December 12, 2012. Miami International Airport. John McAfee walked off the plane, disheveled, unshaven, and victorious. He had outfitted a 2-country manhunt, faked a medical emergency, and turned a guaranteed capture into a free ticket home. Federal agents questioned him briefly, but with no U.S. charges pending, they had to let him go. He strolled out into the Florida sunshine, flashing a grin. It's good to be home, but domesticity didn't suit a man addicted to the edge. By 2013, he was married to Janice, a woman 30 years his junior, and trying to play house in Portland. The experiment lasted for months. He was bored senseless. He produced a viral YouTube video titled "How to Uninstall McAfee Antivirus," a surreal, dark comedy featuring guns, women, and bath salts, mocking the software that still bore his name. By 2018, he had found his next act, cryptocurrency evangelist, Bitcoin, Ethereum, altcoins. John declared them the future and himself their prophet. In seeing this from 2026, he wasn't entirely wrong about the tech. I hope every one of you got some Bitcoin following his advice back then. He moved on to a 75-foot yacht equipped with satellite internet, an armory of firearms, and Janice as his first mate. Why a yacht? Because he knew what was coming. John hadn't filed a tax return since 2010. He hadn't paid $1 to the IRS in 8 years. Taxation is theft, he'd tell interviewers, smirking. The IRS is a criminal organization. The IRS, unsurprisingly, disagreed. In January 2019, a federal grand jury secretly indicted McAfee on 8 counts of tax evasion, potential decades in prison. Rather than surrender, John fired up the yacht's engines and disappeared into the Caribbean. He tweeted a photo of himself on deck, rifle in hand. "Today, I left the US. I'm freer than ever." What followed was an 18-month maritime game of cat and mouse unmatched in modern fugitive history. He country hopped by Cuba, Dominican Republic, Bahamas, possibly Venezuela. He relied on cash and cryptocurrency, using encrypted phones and a VPN to mask his location. He claimed to employ body doubles and disguises. He posted photos with lookalikes, joking that even seeing me doesn't mean you've seen me. In a brilliant paradox, his fame protected him. Governments prefer quiet arrests. John made that impossible by broadcasting his location or decoy locations to millions of followers. In July 2019, he was detained in the Dominican Republic on suspicion of carrying illegal firearms. After 4 days of negotiations, he was released. He raised a glass of rum as the yacht pulled away. "Even when I'm arrested, I walk free." But the net was tightening. Exhausted by constant motion and possibly limited by COVID travel restrictions, John made an uncharacteristic move in late 2020. He stopped running. He and Janice rented an apartment near Barcelona, Spain. On October 5, 2020, he went to El Prat Airport, reportedly bound for Istanbul. At check-in, a passport scan flagged his name. Within minutes, Spanish police surrounded him. After years of high seas evasion, John McAfee was arrested on a U.S. Department of Justice warrant. The game was over. Or was it? June 23, 2021. Brian's 2 Prison, Barcelona. John McAfee, 75 years old, sat in a concrete cell awaiting extradition. He had been locked up for 8 months. No guns, no gadgets, no Twitter on demand, just walls and time. Through his lawyers, he managed sporadic tweets. One he wrote, "I am content in here. I have friends. But know that if I hang myself a lot, Epstein, it will be no fault of mine." The reference to Jeffrey Epstein was unmistakable. John's followers took note. He had even gotten a tattoo months earlier, $WHACKD, claiming he had been warned of a plot against him, insisted he would not commit suicide. On June 23, 2021, at 1 p.m., the Spanish National Court signed his extradition order. Within the hour, John was informed he'd be transferred to U.S. custody imminently. He called Janice. "I love you. I'll call you this evening." There was no evening call. At approximately 7 p.m., guards found John McAfee hanging from a bedsheet in his cell. He was pronounced dead at 7:23 p.m. The official cause, suicide by hanging. He was 75 years old, caught at last but never tried. But you thought the story ended with a quiet funeral? No way. For his supporters and for his wife Janice, this was the final act of a grand conspiracy. Janice publicly insisted John was upbeat, that the timing hours after the extradition order was too convenient. The Spanish autopsy confirmed asphyxiation, consistent with hanging, with no drugs in his system. The investigation was closed as a suicide. Yet the questions linger like smoke from one of his bonfires. Did he have files on powerful people that made him a liability? Was he silenced? Or did the man who faked his death twice, the ultimate trickster, simply orchestrate one final escape into legend? The most tragic and perhaps most fitting possibility is the simplest one. The man who vowed never to yield to the state. The man who said it was better to live one day as a lion than 1,000 years as a lamb, simply made the only exit left on his own terms. He refused to give the U.S. government the satisfaction of locking him away until his body gave out. John McAfee built an empire on fear, turned paranoia into profit, and fought the law for a decade and mostly won. He lived as a digital age outlaw, turning his own life into a piece of performance art that blurred the line between genius and madness.